Good afternoon, everybody. I think we have NDTV online. So look, thank you very much for coming up to the 7th floor at this time of an afternoon on a specially organised cold, wet and windy day for our Indian colleagues. But it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome to Fletcher Dr. Ghosh, and his fantastic colleagues. Where are they? There they are, Ren Singh and and I also want to give a big shout out to the Fletcher South Asia Society and also the South Asia Regional Committee at the Tufts. Thank you for your support this evening. And I hope that this is a harbinger of things to come, and that the Fletcher South Asia Society will be doing a lot more events like this in the months. So Dr. Ghosh is no stranger to Fletcher, and he's no stranger in particular to many colleagues here. And there's been a long-standing relationship between CEW and SERP, and I'm grateful to Dr. Gallagher, Dean Gallagher and her team for building this relationship in the research they've been doing on community-based natural farming, which is looking at sort of the impacts on income, productivity, resilience in India. So critically important issue, becoming more and more important by the day. And so because of that relationship and you know, because I think of the extraordinary growth in CEW's influence and mandate and span, we're really hoping to be able to grow the connections between Fletcher and CEW and Tufts more broadly. And in particular, I think it's timely. You know, the university is sort of discussing the advent of a new global strategy, which means pivoting our relationships and our strategic partnerships to the global south. But in this sort of very flat world, global south it takes on a new meaning. And as you will hear, I think, hopefully from some of the comments from Dr. Ghosh, that really, you know, there's no way to imagine the future in terms of sustainable development, in terms of economic development, in terms of sort of different poles of power and influence within the world, without going through Delhi and without going through the vibrancy of the Indian economy and the I think interesting developments in Indian political life. So being able to have a trusted partnership with one of the leading think tanks in Asia would be a great boon for us here at Fletcher. Which brings us to a moment where we're going to sign in a deftly coordinated fashion at the moment an agreement of cooperation, which will then lead into a much more detailed conversation about how our cooperation will develop. So we're looking at research, we're looking at fellowships, we're looking at sponsored events together, and also being able to bring our collective minds to play on some of the great challenges of our time. So this is where I have to say some nice things about Aaron. I warned him.
It doesn't happen that often.
No, it does. But most seriously, you know, I think that Dr. Ghosh is really barnstorming the international stage at the moment. He holds a number of significant advisory positions to governments, to intergovernmental processes, where he's been able to bring his addition and I think steel trap analytical capabilities to the benefit of the international community. So he is, of course, recognised over many years as a policy expert. He's a widely published author, a columnist, and an institution builder. And I had the opportunity of seeing the new headquarters of CEW, the new building. And I was like, oh, I'd like to work here. It's really just a wonderful testament to the growth and the impact of CEW. And so can't wait to see how you inhabit that office and go on to greater things. He is the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and has really led its growth and development as to one of the leading think tanks. He advises, as I said, everybody, but I think just to point out that he plays a very important role this year in advising the Sherpa for the G20, and of course is playing a very important role in the finance track of the G20. And is no stranger to the G20, having been very involved in the T20, the think tank 20, that accompanies it for Indonesia's presidency last year. And then he and I were able to work closely together, which we do occasionally, but last year in the high-level expert group on the credibility and accountability of net zero announcements by non-state actors. So that's called the H leg. And what that was an attempt by the Secretary General of the UN to put his arms around the non-state actors' pledges towards net zero, which led to the sort of red line around greenwashing that we saw announced in COP27. So there are many, many other feathers in his cap and many other arrows in his quiver. And we're delighted to be able to welcome him here and delighted to be able to enter into this cooperation agreement. So we're going to sign this. You should sort of applaud or very excited. And at that point, I'm going to go sit back in my chair and we'll be able to listen to Dr. Ghosh. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Or, sorry. Let's connect to the top. Okay. Move this. Switch off. We're good. So first of all, my sincere thanks to the Immigration Guide for inviting me. But first of all, let me say thanks for coming over to CW a few months ago. Let me also say thanks for sending over one of your alumni a few months ago, Fran Jen, who's my special assistant. And she might not remember, but we have tapped into her wisdom when we first set up. We had, at that time, a network sort of international advisory board. We didn't have money to bring the advisory. Our founding chairperson, Mrs. Suresh Prabhu, knew which tried really well, and said, you know, he's someone we need to take advice from. So the history, of course, goes back a long way. And of course, Dean Gallagher, we've had a long-standing relationship again for, you know, was just reading her research and learning from it, but more recently being able to conceptualize a major research project that CW and Fletcher. I had the honor of meeting President Quesada this afternoon, and you know, I'm now thinking back the 1 hour 6 minutes I spent with him. If I were a journalist, and this is the perfect way a politician can deflect questions back to the person who's supposed to be asking the question. So rather than optimize my time with a former president, he optimized his time and asked me, you know, a lot of exam questions. But all that set aside, we are of course delighted at CW to be able to enter into this agreement of cooperation with the Fletcher School, and we certainly hope that we can do a lot at a faculty to senior researcher level, at a student to student and junior researcher level, and of course through this new Global South Fellowship program that we have also just announced. I wanted to kick off my talk today with a few stories that happened around the time of when CW was being set up, and it will explain to you why you see this title. The first story was in December of 2009. This was the Copenhagen Climate Summit. I was one of about 10,000 people standing in -8 degrees, queued up. I think behind me was the CEO of Coca-Cola. I think in front of me was one of the negotiators from China. We were all sort of outside the room. In a way, I was the least of the players. But it struck me then, it was an epiphany, that something about how we are organizing our conversations in dealing with a very complex global problem, and certainly how we are trying to think about the actions is broken and something has to be fixed. So a month later, I wrote the concept note for CW in January of 2010. Another story that happened just around February or March of 2010. At that time, I was a postdoctoral research fellow at Princeton. And we used to always have these academic seminars, as universities do. And from time to time, I would be asked to give the India perspective. And I would give the India perspective. And it would bother me a little bit. And so one day I stood up and said, hang on, the Global South is not a case study. Which basically means that why are we denying ourselves the opportunity to frame the conversation at a global level, whether we come from the Global South or come from the Global North? Why are we slotting ourselves, bucketing ourselves into our sort of national identities? And the third thing that happened just a few months after that, when I was trying to put together the board of CW before I went back, the person who is now our chairperson, in my first meeting with him, he listened to me, and then he said, have you ever worked in India? And I was a little struck because I had left India after doing my undergrad. So I said, no, I have worked on India, but I've not worked in India. I've worked on India, I've worked on Brazil, I've worked on South Africa, but I've not worked in India. So he just smiled. I say this because these epiphanies about something is broken, you got to do something about it. This frustration that while we want to do something about it, we are inadvertently bucketed into slots that we want to break out of. And yet this feeling that do we know enough to work in very complex geographies, even if we happen to come from there, are all part about this being your moment or our moment, about the change that needs to happen. What Dean Kite just said, all routes will somehow lead through Delhi. They'll somehow lead through Beijing and Jakarta and Brasilia and Hanoi. So what I will describe to you in the course of my talk today is a little bit about how, from the perspective of India, but not just an Indian perspective, what are the things we are dealing with? What are the challenges we are faced with? How we're trying to overcome them, and leave you perhaps with a sense of agency of what is possible in the moment we are in. Some of you who attended the talk by my colleagues, Nandini and Raymond, a little while ago might have seen the slide, but let me introduce CEW once more to you. We are a public policy research institution that seeks to use data, integrated analysis, and strategic outreach to explain and change the use, reuse, and misuse of resources, and in the process, impact sustainable development at scale. Now, any institution you go to will have some kind of chart of how they work. So this is our chart, but our chart keeps evolving because the scope of work expands and narrows and melds into each other. Researchers are, have free minds to do various things, and we try to think how it can all come together. So we organize our work around 3 pillars: the system level transformation. Let me get out of the way so you can see it a little better. The system level transformations, such as the power sector transition, move towards renewable energy, but also the economic transformation through a low carbon pathway, the future of power markets, how they might evolve, the whole focus on industrial sustainability, especially the economies that are still industrializing, but also, given that we come from a developing country, but also work in other developing countries, a big focus on sustainable livelihoods. What will be the new jobs of the future? While we work on the system level transformations, we also have to imagine and reimagine the quality of life that we endure. You know, the luxury of breathing the clean air that you have outside these windows is not necessarily the luxury we have. We've got to do something about it. We've got to do something about the food we ingest, the water we drink, the air we breathe, how we heat or cool ourselves, how we move. And those are the quality of life, here and now issues that we deal with. In order to do any of this, we need to deal with enablers. It's finance, whether it's technology, whether it's increasingly a renewed, a new focus on resource efficiency and circular economy, a big focus around mapping risks and increasing resilience, and of course, to do it through international cooperation. We now have a team of, as of this morning, 235 people. We've had several hundred peer-reviewed research publications, but as I like to remind my colleagues, we're only as good as the last thing we wrote or did. So if you mess it up, credibility falls. And for a research institution, that's pretty much the only thing you have apart from your people. We have worked across India in 22 of our states, but we've also worked in several emerging markets in Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, and so forth, and have tried to bring those perspectives as we go along. My lecture was titled Development, Energy Security, and Renewed Multilateralism. So, as I was taught in high school, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So this is what I'm going to tell you. Sustainable development for all. I want to focus on those here and now issues, because the whole notion about climate action, that present at the moment, present at the creation story I told you about Copenhagen, was about climate action at a global level. But in order to get the political traction for it, you have to figure out how you're dealing with the development challenges that people face. So let me talk a little bit about those development issues. Let's start with energy. I mentioned earlier, we focus a lot on data. So we started in 2020, we started the work in 2014, we released the first report of its kind in 2015. It was the largest ever survey on multidimensional energy access that had been conducted in the world. We looked at electricity and cooking energy. You should understand that at that time, when we released this document, India had the largest number of people in the world without access to electricity or heating. This was the same month when the Sustainable Development Goals were announced, September 2015. But the millions of data points that we collected allowed us to then inform government, inform major national programs that then electrified pretty much every single household. There were 28 million households that were electrified within 18 months. The penetration of clean cooking energy went up from 50% of households to over 80% of households. But we continue to do that. So we've gone from just access to looking at how many hours of power you're getting, how many blackout days you have, what is the voltage, is the transformer burned down. This heavy focus on data allows a research institution to inform things in a less ideological way. I won't say non-ideological way, but in a less ideological way, where the data really helps to inform public policy and public policy action at scale. One of the things that is happening in addition to the supply side push is the demand side change. If an Indian today is consuming 1/3 of the power supply of the global average of power consumption and 1/10 of an average American citizen, if we aspire to that level of power consumption, then we would have maybe a 5-fold increase in our energy demand. And if we, of course, fuel that using fossil energy, then we would have a real problem in terms of not just our sustainable development pathway, but the world as a whole. So one of the things India did was looked at advanced market commitments to procure hundreds of millions of LED light bulbs and then sell them to the population. So that advanced market commitment and public procurement allowed for a reduction in the cost of a single light bulb from well over 300 rupees to about 50 rupees, and in some cases even lesser. So it's an example of how supply side push, but also demand side behavioral change can move things at scale. Where we are running behind the clock actually is in water. So one of the things we are focused a lot on at CEW is looking at more efficient groundwater management, because India consumes more groundwater than China and the United States put together. So if we don't, and groundwater means there's an energy dimension because you're pumping it out. So we also have advised on the largest solar-based irrigation program in the world. In fact, one of my colleagues mapped out every single district in India on about 20 parameters to understand what kind of business model for solar-based irrigation would work district by district by district. And then we created a decision support toolkit in order to do that. One of the things we are now promoting is the circular economy of wastewater. So while we don't treat enough of our sewage, just about 40%, that will go up to about 80% of sewage treatment over the next 2.5 decades. What we've been mapping out is how could that retreated sewage water then have a big play in irrigation, in industry, in energy, have cost savings, have reduction in chemical fertilizer use, because then you're using the nutrients from the wastewater, and it creates a circular economy for wastewater treatment in order to reduce the groundwater depletion, but also create a whole new business model, especially in our cities. Food. We were just talking about this research program that we have going with Dean Gallagher's team about community-based natural farming. Now, the state of Andhra Pradesh initiated this several years ago about using a huge network of women-run self-help groups that had originally come about for the purpose of microfinance. But because that social capital existed, the same women-run self-help groups then became the sort of training centers to train other women farmers and other men farmers on a system of natural farming, which is basically you're moving away from fertilizer and using the soil to do primarily the job of growing crops. I have personally met some of these women farmers. Of course, we have a much larger survey and research program going on. And one of the farmers I met, she has a half-acre plot of land. She was growing 15 different crops on that half-acre plot of land. And one of the things I asked her, I said, what made you take that risk of potential downside in incomes when you're moving away from state subsidy and public procurement of your crops towards moving towards a completely different agricultural practice? She talked about having lost her husband a few years earlier, who passed away. She was trying to put her two boys through high school and college. And she said, in our dialect, we have the saying, and I'm transliterating it. We look for solutions where we have lost our precious things. So in a way, she was trying to say, I had the option of just selling this land and moving into the city, which happens to many distressed smallholder farmers across the world, or I could double down and try and do that experiment here. Now, whether that experiment, that single anecdote I'm giving you is scaling up is what we are now trying to figure out. So our food systems team mapped out about 30 odd sustainable agricultural practices and across India to see, what has the potential for scale. It's agroforestry, precision farming, integrated pest management, system of rice intensification, and so on and so forth, crop rotation, rainwater harvesting. Basically, these are the area under the agricultural system of practice, the millions of hectares, the scale of adoption, meaning the number of farmers, and the geographical spread. How many states, like say mulching, practiced in 17 states, but less than 5 million farmers when India has hundreds of millions. So this first study of its kind to look at, if you're interested in sustainable agriculture, let's start with understanding what is happening, and then seeing what is gaining scale and what is not gaining scale, helps you to go from an individual, anecdote to thinking about what is that system level transformation that we want to. Mobility. Why is mobility important? Let me again give a personal anecdote. I grew up in Delhi. That way I had a lot of opportunity, but I did not grow up in a wealthy family. So throughout my schooling or college, I had no access to personalized motorized transport. Often, even I didn't have access to public motorized transport. So it's walk. Now, if you took urban India alone is the world's third largest country as well by population. And urban India will add another 400, 500 million people over the course of the next 2 decades. How we move is not just a concern for automobile companies. How we move means access to livelihoods, access to schooling, access to health facilities, the design of cities, compact or expansive, and of course, the opportunity for new industry altogether. So CW did the largest survey of urban mobility in India. And guess what? More than 60% of urban Indians are like who I grew up as. A primary mode of mobility are 2 legs. And this is not me when I was 5. This is me when I was even 22, before I left. So how do you then think about mobility as a development dimension rather than just a supply side story? So one thing we did is we mapped out, and I was discussing this with President Quesada as well. What will happen as we develop these new industries? Will we lose jobs in traditional automobile sectors? Will we gain jobs in new sectors? So we looked at the gains and the trade-offs. We estimate that in the internal combustion engine industry, we'll lose 160,000 jobs, but we'll gain about 120,000 jobs. Now there is a net job loss, but you will gain much more on not just the CO2 reduced, but the investments that you gain, a few $100 billion. In fact, our estimation is our targets for e-mobility for 2030 is a $206 billion market. And you will create a whole new architecture of what the manufacturing industry could look like. But in India, we don't care how many Teslas are getting sold. That is not the focus of public policy. The focus of public policy is the design of cities, the design of public transport, or the design of goods transport. So I'm giving you this picture of a electric three-wheeler, tuk-tuk, or what we call an auto rickshaw. Our mobility colleagues at CW helped the city of Kochi in Kerala design a program to convert about 10,000 auto rickshaws into into electric auto rickshaws. We are now supporting another state to procure 1,000 electric buses. Last year, India did a a tender of over 5,000 electric buses at one go, which will now be scaled up to 50,000 electric buses. Now, the cost of an electric bus is much more than the cost of a diesel bus. State transport utilities are even more fiscally broken than state electricity utilities. So they don't have the upfront capital to invest. So the design of the tender was you pay for the distance traveled via an electric public bus, and then you amortize the cost over the length of the asset's life. The point I'm trying to make here is that something that seems like actually just one industry, and the auto industry is a major industry in many emerging markets as a driver of jobs, etc. If that industry is going to shift towards electric, what does that mean for the political economy of jobs, growth, and sustainability? And finally, I want to talk about cooling. We're a hot tropical country, getting hotter over every year. And this February itself, I think, we're predicted to have the hottest February ever. So we helped with how do we deal with this issue? We first started working on modeling HFC emissions, the refrigerants that go into your air conditioners. We did the first modeling of its kind. Based on that analysis, India was able to go to the Montreal Protocol and negotiate the Kigali Amendment. But it was one of the first major economies to ratify the Kigali Amendment. After that was done, CW and other think tanks came together to co-write the India Cooling Action Plan, the first country in the world that came out with a cooling action plan, not just active cooling with chemical refrigerants, but also passive cooling and focus on thermal comfort. But we're not nearly there, because over the next 2 decades, we'll have about 100 million more air conditioners sold. Now, if those are not efficient, we are in deep trouble. How do we cool with less warming? But not many of us can afford air conditioners. So I was just mentioning to some of you, the market for super efficient ceiling fans is 20 billion. But we haven't yet, unlike the LED light bulbs, we have not yet come up with the business models that can help with the public procurement and then distribution of ceiling fans. I have spent a lot of time on these aspects of the development aspects of food, water, energy access, cooling, mobility, to explain that the transitions that we are seeing don't start from a climate negotiation. The transitions that we're seeing happen from these quality of life issues that create their own political economies, their own positives and negatives. The big negative, though, is despite all of this, we are highly, highly, highly vulnerable to climate change. So at CW, one of the other things we are doing, and it's work in progress, and we very much want more and more data scientists to help us out, is developing the first high-resolution climate risk atlas in India, and one of the first of its kind in the global south. What do we mean by high-resolution climate atlas? Easy way to think about it is, if I wanted to buy a house in Florida, I'll probably get a flood risk estimate neighborhood by neighborhood, and my insurance will be marked up accordingly. I won't have that assessment for the whole state of Odisha, which gets hit by super cyclones every few years. So what we are trying to do is, at a district by district level, map out what does climate risk look like. Over the last 50 years, from 1970, we know we've had a 12-fold increase in cyclonic events, 20-fold increase in the associated flooding events. But when we map that onto where the people live, we know that about 80% of Indians are in areas that are highly vulnerable to extreme climate events. This is already the story of the last 50 years as it has evolved. How do we become more resilient against rising climate risks in the future? Now, while we're trying to do that, we also have to balance energy security and energy access and affordability. Incidentally, those cartoons that we're putting up, apart from all the nerdy work we do, every Wednesday, CW publishes a cartoon on sustainability called Water on Earth. This is one of those cartoons, and you can get them all on our website. But this Water on Earth cartoon series is now being taught in mass communication schools in India about a different way of communicating sustainability. So just taking a step back for a second from India, the reason all the roads go through Delhi or Jakarta or Hanoi or Cape Town is that 88% of new electricity demand over the next 2 decades will come from emerging markets. India alone will drive 25% of energy growth over the next 2 decades. So what happens in these emerging economies matters for the planet. But we also see that, not counting China, over 60% of emerging markets are already showing a trend towards either peaking or plateauing in the use of fossil fuels for the electricity generation. That does not mean they have transitioned entirely, but how does India or China leapfrog from coal towards renewables? How does an Egypt or Argentina leapfrog from gas to renewables and so forth is a matter for the world, but also for these countries. So one of the things this graphic, this argument comes from a book I wrote a few years ago, but I would argue that it applies to many emerging markets, that there is not one, but many energy transitions that are underway. The first is what I talked about in the environment, that you have hundreds of millions of people. There's still over 700 million people without access to electricity, over 2 billion people without access to clean cooking energy. So that move from traditional to modern sources of energy is energy transition number one. But then I also talked about this. We are a rapidly urbanizing world. And the shift in patterns of energy demand from rural to urban areas will impact then how we heat and cool our buildings, what kind of transportation systems we design, what kind of industries we create. Of course, this has to happen within a rapidly shrinking carbon constraint. But what is not understood well enough is that with this growth in energy demand from emerging markets, we will also therefore more deeply integrate into global energy markets. And what will be the geopolitics of energy or clean energy as new sources of growth come to the fore is something that we have to think about, and I'll get to it in a second. For instance, India's primary energy share is still very fossil dependent. You don't have to get into the details, but even as we are growing a lot of renewables, bulk of it is coal, oil, and natural gas. However, think about it this way. We are a fossil fuel importing country, so we've got a number of exporters that supply fossil fuels to us. But when we look at renewable, RE pluses, solar, wind, batteries, critical minerals, there's a huge concentration. We have heavily imported, we import 80% of solar panels, we import 80% of crude oil. But there's a greater concentration in the suppliers of the clean energy sources, the products of the sources. So when we think about the geopolitics of energy, this is something that we'll have to consider, even as we try and transform the economy. Let me quickly run through this. In Glasgow, Prime Minister announced something called the Panchang, basically the 5 essences. How does that translate? What is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to reduce emissions intensity of GDP by 45%. Earlier, the target was 35%. By 2016, the latest official numbers we have reached 24%. So a long way to go. We're trying to get to 50% of cumulative electricity power capacity by 2030. Earlier, the target was 40%. Now we reached 40% in 2021 itself. We've aimed to get to net zero by 2070. I'm happy to answer questions why it was 2070 and not 2050. But I would say it's not a call for an energy transition. It's a call for an economic transformation. Everything changes in how you make things, eat things, clothe things. But here is where it gets particularly interesting. You want to build 500 gigawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity. India will be the first country, if we did manage to do that, that will build more renewables than its entire electricity system as it exists today. First major economy that will do that. In order to do that, there's 1 hour you have to suffer me. We would have had to deploy 10.5 megawatts of renewables. We have to do that 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, non-stop for the next 8.5 years. That's the scale. So literally, every minute I'm talking, someone's got to be screwing in solar panels somewhere. And that's why the demand side, again, is very important. In October, India formally launched what is called Mission Life. And the idea is, where is the behavioral dimension of this? And I would argue it's not just about turning off the lights at an individual level. It is the enabling of markets that respond to a demand for sustainable consumption. One of you was asking me a little while earlier about the slowdown in the deployment of renewables, and especially now that we think about the pace at which this has to happen, you can see that there has been a steady increase in renewable energy capacity, but yes, there was a drop in the growth rate. This growth rate basically has to go exponentially. Let me put it another way. I talked about the 10.5 megawatts an hour. Even if we go to 500 gigawatts by 2030, that will be the base of an inflection point for net zero, because by net zero 2070, we will need 5,600 gigawatts of solar capacity, 1,800 gigawatts of wind capacity. So every few years, there has to be an exponential shift, even as we have already become the 4th largest renewable energy country in the world. But this is where then the story becomes a little bit more interesting. This normal supply side approach towards building energy infrastructure. Someone's going to generate power, someone's going to transmit it, and someone's going to distribute it, and someone's going to consume it, is not going to work. World over, still, as I mentioned, over 800 million people without access to electricity. But we've also seen that hundreds of millions of people have gotten access to electricity using distributed renewable energy solutions. Now, traditionally, that used to be one solar lantern given to somebody as a grant. And whether it worked, does not work, you don't know. It's a nice blog in the New York Times, and then no one cares about it. What we did was we mapped out the real potential for distributed renewables to drive livelihoods. These are pictures: solar-based food dryers, solar-based textile looms, solar-based irrigation pumps, paddle looms, deep freezers and refrigerators. This is my favorite story. We've got a lot of cattle in the world. I mean, India is the largest cattle population. They don't get green fodder enough. But solar-based hydroponics to generate green fodder is a $4 billion market in our estimation. Distributed renewables-driven livelihoods is a $50 billion market in our estimation. So instead of just estimating it, we decided to test this out. So even though we are a nonprofit, we created a sort of VC fund of $3 million and tied up with the largest social enterprise incubator in the country, evaluated over 100 such startups and invested in 6 with another 9 in the larger portfolio to help them cross not just the commercial value of the tech value of death, but also the commercial value of death. Basically get them to about $1 million of sales so that then regular commercial bankers, etc., are willing to give them loans. In just the last 2.5 years since we launched this initiative called Powering Livelihoods, we have had about 10,000 technology deployments, over nearly 18,000 livelihoods have been enabled. 72% of them have been women. And based on that experience, India has come out with the first policy framework of its kind in the world to use distributed renewables for livelihoods. So we have to start reimagining this energy transition, not just as an energy story, but as a jobs and livelihood story, as a new form of power market story to go further. And yet, the criticalities in the supply chain remain. Over the last decade, there's some research we've just done for the G20. We see that the number of countries that have more and more concentrated imports for solar or for batteries has increased rather than diversified. And this is creating an energy security question, at least, for many countries, even if they are thinking about the growth in their clean energy sectors. Let me put it slightly differently. Globally, we see a huge increase in demand for solar, for batteries, for critical minerals. But when we map out what are our strengths and weaknesses, one of you was asking me about this. We've unpacked the entire value chain of, say, making a solar module or a battery. And we see in very few, the green parts, where we have currently the ability to do more than 80% of installation. So in many things, we're heavily dependent on getting those materials, minerals, components from elsewhere. If this is India's challenge, it's also Vietnam's challenge, and it is also Kenya's challenge. It is also Namibia's challenge. Now, how do we then create a new energy security architecture that creates resilient and reliable supply chains rather than just concentrated supply chains? This is not going to be easy, especially take the example of batteries. Today we are focused on this battery pack production. If I wanted to make battery cells, it would take, using our industrial policy, it would take 1 to 4 years to build up that capacity. It's much harder to do mineral extraction. A few weeks ago, India's Geological Survey announced that we found 5.9 million tons of reserves of lithium, one of the largest in the world in one state. But even if those reserves were extractable, to build up that capacity, we'll need to spend about 2 decades. A few years ago, CEW did the first mapping of critical minerals in India, looking at the economic importance of minerals and their supply risk, where we get it from. So that's the high economic importance, high supply risk, basically very critical. And then India went and announced big electric vehicle targets. So many of the minerals that were not critical started moving into the criticality zone. I'm intentionally giving these sort of technical examples because it's not just about what you go and sign on in a climate agreement, but to really get into the meat of the story, to understand where the opportunities lie, the huge investment opportunities, and yet what is not yet happening. So what is not yet happening? This new story around green hydrogen. Again, CEW was intimately involved in the drafting of the green hydrogen mission that India has just announced. On paper, it's the world's largest green hydrogen mission, with a target of 5 million tons per annum by 2030, which is half of all of the EU's domestic green hydrogen production target. But while we notice that a bulk of the green hydrogen production is optimal, again, within the tropics, that's where you'll get the lowest cost production. Most of the projects are actually happening in the global north. So the same story we saw with solar a decade ago, we will see with green hydrogen, a critical industrial fuel of the 21st century. Again, we have to think about the energy architecture that gets us there. So here's my proposition, that as we think about those quality of life issues, as we think about the energy trilemma balancing, let's keep in mind these 3 maxims. Energy security for any major economy is not the same as energy independence. I mean, since Churchill's times, we've been promising energy independence, but actually no economy is energy independent. It's how you become energy secure. Similarly, in emerging markets across the world are going through an energy transition. So what are the conditions under which that transition is not a slow boom story, but can be a leapfrog? And protectionism and indigenization are not the same thing. In Davos, primary conversation was US IRA versus EU Fit for 55 and the subsidies war. But when you have a subsidies war between the two major economic regions in the world, I'm left thinking, okay, what does that mean for industrial policy for the global south? So as we get to a more sustainable planet, do we widen or narrow the technology divide? Let me quickly go through a couple more ideas and then I'll stop. I've been speaking for a long time. What's the amount of money that's needed? Our estimation at CW was that we will need about $10 trillion in 2020 prices for our net zero transition. But to get that $10 trillion, we need to do a lot of innovation in finance, whether it is for large-scale renewables, whether it is for distributed renewables for livelihoods, for the repurposing of fossil assets, for investing in new technology, R&D, or even insure against the climate shocks I was referring to. Which then brings me to the final theme of my lecture about multilateralism. 30 years after the end of the Cold War, when we had a globalization of everything, goods, services, ideas, to an extent, people, we are now entering a phase where potentially there's a weaponization of everything. How do we move our economies and our planet onto a more sustainable trajectory when multilateralism is weakened? So I want to leave you with these thoughts. Number one, we got to solve for a bunch of market failures. The number one market failure is that how do we insure against climate risks that are nonlinear by nature? Number two, the money is not flowing where the sun shines the most. Number three, that we are not pricing externalities, not just carbon, but land. If I don't price land well, how will I build out the renewable energy infrastructure? I will need a lot of land. I will need a lot of steel to make solar parks. How do I price externalities of materials? And we are not focusing on sustainable consumption. At CW, we've come up with ideas around each of these themes. I don't want to get into them, but many of them are coming through in how we are positioning our G20 presidency. Similarly, we also have a bunch of political failures. We have a lack of accountability at the international level. How does the UNFCCC move from being a bank of commitments that are losing value to becoming a bank of actions? What do you actually do? How do we move from protectionism and industrial policy to technology co-development so that the global south has a stake in the emerging clean tech future? How do we move from energy security of the past to an energy security for the fuels of the future, for instance, the rules for green hydrogen? How do we have a just transition, or what I've argued as a joint energy transition for our economies? So this is my last slide, and then I'm done. CW is supporting 11 ministries of Government of India for its G20 presidency. But across the Sherpa track, the finance track, what is it that we're trying to do? If you look at the themes that I've talked about, it boils down to promoting a circular economy based on sustainable lifestyles, promoting the financial de-risking platforms that will deliver trillions for the billions of people in the global south, promoting a way to create an energy security architecture for the fuels of the future, finding the way to refinance the sustainable development agenda. We're halfway down that path, and many countries are backsliding. And how do we use the decarbonization story along with the digitalization story and leverage data for development? These are the big themes around which those ideas around quality of life, energy security, sustainability, and development come together through renewed multilateralism that we are trying to. I've spoken for a long time. I can't guarantee we deploy 10.5 megawatts of renewables in this time. But if I have stimulated your brain juices a little bit, then please feel free to ask me any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
Take a couple of questions, I think.
Yes, please go ahead.
I have a few questions, but I'll keep them short. The first is of the 10 trillion that you envision will need to successfully enable net zero. How much of that can be raised domestically?
Right.
The second, I am from Punjab, so for me, the issue of the groundwater thing is pretty relevant and something that I understand. But I was wondering what in your research has emerged as potential behavioral incentives for farmers to move away from state subsidy crops to things that are actually suited to the land and geography of Punjab. And third was purely procedural. You emphasize the importance of data in CW's research. I was wondering how much of that is collected by your team and how much of that is sourced from Media or other.
Let me take a couple of
would an international framework for renewable energy mining balance its environmental externalities?
Sorry, international framework for renewable energy?
Imagining the amount of solar panels we are going to need. What are we balancing the environmental cost of renewable energy mining? And what would you as an advisor suggest the PMO for mining in Kashmir, given its socio-political and environmental?
All right.
To what extent do you think it makes sense to erect barriers in order to create domestic industries in some industries where India has potential in a large local market?
No.
One more question, which is that there's a lot of talk about installed capacity, but we've seen a lot of states with, even though there's a lot of installed capacity, it's not being used. So right now, what's the policy on evacuation?
Yeah. Let me answer this 3 sets of our 9 questions, and then I'll come to a second one. Let me mix and match a little bit. Data, most of the data that we use is collected by us. Us meaning we then train surveyors in the hundreds who then go collect it, and then we do the quality control, and sometimes we've got to go and redo it all over again. However, we also emphasize, I mentioned in our KPIs right at the outset, about 110 different data sets we have either created or made public, in the sense that sometimes data exists, but you have to spend a lot of time going through, hundreds of unscannable PDF documents, etc. So that is a public service also we're trying to do, and then putting it out there. So that's the approach we take. On the agriculture side, to be honest, I don't have a good answer for Punjab right now. But what we are trying to see, for the reason, for me, the experiment in Andhra is not so much about the community-based natural farm. For me, the story there is actually about the women self-help groups. It's that approach of using social capital of those networks to scale up something of a different kind is where the interest lies. What is your first question? The 10 trillion. So quick numbers, $10 trillion. Of that, what we call the investment gap is $3.5 trillion, which is that what is available through the financial system and what is not available. Of that $3.5 trillion that has to come from outside, $1.4 trillion is what we estimate has to be concessional finance in order to de-risk and crowd in the investment. On the renewable energy, I don't have a story for the world yet, but we have at CW of late been working on, so if our first major solar parks projects came up about 13 years ago, they are sort of at that so-called half-life of their existence. But many will not last 25 years. That's what the factory reset says. So within 4 or 5 years, if these modules have to be repurposed. We have helped to draft now the policy around the sustainable repurposing of these materials. So the same has to apply, and a lot of focus has to be on battery recycling and critical minerals sourcing. Because otherwise, whether it's in Jammu and Kashmir or whether it's in Bolivia, we'll be digging up more and more things from the ground rather than finding the value that you can do from. Question was on
tariffs and
what is the other question?
Renewable energy evacuation.
Yes. So now renewable energy evacuation, I can give a very long answer. My short answer is the future of power markets is not about renewable energy evacuation. And if we don't internalize this of the fact that we are going to have much more distributed sources of energy, and therefore how you trade that in a localized setting, how you bypass the grid to have direct offtake for industry, how you use district heating and cooling or electric vehicle charging as an electricity balancing approach. Those markets don't exist right now. We don't even in regular power markets, we have only long-term contracts. We barely less than 10% of electricity trading is on the spot market. So that is where the innovation needs to happen. Did I miss out on something? On industrial policy. Larry Summers in Davos said it's not a bad thing if subsidies are used to correct for market failure. But to me, then the French, I think it was the French finance minister on the same panel said, it's not about protectionism, it is about protecting our economic interests. And I'm trying to think, how is that different? And then Kristalina Georgieva said, look, this game that Europe and America are playing only works if you have technology transfer written into your plans. While that sounds good, my response to that research that Nandini and I have done of looking at more than 30 different clean energy initiatives, technology transfer doesn't happen. And that is why we are promoting this whole thing of technology co-development. And how do you create or design or think about the incentive structures that allow you to indigenize and yet not protect. And we don't have the rules sorted out for that yet. Maybe we have time for 2 more sets of questions. So quickly, you had raised your hand first. Please.
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for the wonderful presentation and the discussion we had before. So my question is, so in the last 5 years, we know that our installed capacity for renewable energy has increased massively, around I think 200%. But our weak transmission grid still remains a bit of a challenge. So, and there are delayed costs, there's transmission line upgrade challenges. So what do you think that the government should be doing to address that? Or what do you think the government's already doing that might be, paving the way for smooth transition?
I want to move away from energy to water. We see a lot of transboundary water conflicts happening within India and with the borders as well. Indus Water Treaty being in focus now. From an energy security point of view, how would you approach sort of trying to solve these kinds of conflicts between states?
From a water security point of view, energy security?
From a water, livelihood, and social security point of view.
So my question, so interestingly for India, most of the oil and gas companies, major oil and gas companies are public sector companies. And they have themselves, pledged to invest in renewable energy.
Yes.
Given the fact that they have money, a source of money, given they have the nudge from the government and given they have skin in the game, do you think that has potential to fructify?
So do we see any initiative on part of Government of India to set up polysilicon ingots manufacturing? That's probably going to be the game changer for all the economic needs.
We're going to a sort of, yes, there is this performance linked incentive scheme. But here's the challenge. If we don't, firstly, it's very hard to, technologically determine what needs to happen. I mean, the solar panels, 2070 will not be what we're doing right now. So being so, and we've seen this with a number of manufacturers in India wanting to say, I've got this technology versus that technology. What is needed is, I would advise on parameters of efficiency combined with materials efficiency and electricity efficiency combined with the incentives that are given. And then let companies figure out how to move forward on that. The other challenge we had was we would keep increasing these anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties. Now, while they might have some legitimacy because they are being dumped by other countries, India is the largest user of anti-dumping duties across industries in the world. If that were a route to industrial development, we should have been a manufacturing powerhouse by now. So we've got to be a little careful in how we design industrial policy while giving some incentive structures. Your question
Oil
was,
marketing companies.
yes, definitely. I mean, can India be Norway? I don't know. I mean, basically sell oil to the world and then invest in, EVs at home. But yes, the balance sheets of the oil marketing companies does give them an opportunity to invest heavily in driving, the big ticket items, such as the heavy capital intensive items like green hydrogen. We are already seeing IOL in Illinois, along with Renew Power, which is a private company, along with a startup looking at green hydrogen. We are seeing other private players looking at green ammonia. We are seeing NTPC, which is the largest thermal power producer, committing to 60 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. So yes, that balance sheet leverage is definitely possible. Your question was water security. In fact, I was discussing this with Melissa McCracken this afternoon. Transboundary waters within a country, that is, to me, that is actually more important. Even though my first paper on water was actually for transboundary waters across countries, because the livelihood conflicts between farmers and pastoralists and others, that's what creates those social tensions. And we don't have the institutional structures right now to do basin level management. So that definitely is a cause for concern. That's why I mentioned after electricity, while we've done a lot, we're running behind the curve on water. Your question was
Transmission rates.
yes, but I answered part of it. The whose question did I miss out? There was a third question now. I answered manufacturing, yes, but I had a thought, but I don't know if you're out of time. We're kind of out of time, but please feel free to ask further questions during the reception.
So please, let's you'll see them in the G20 communique. So anyway, please join us for a reception, and I'm sure you can pigeonhole more questions. So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure. This was a great honor. So thank you.
Trillions for the billions, but we need more than that. We need the best and the brightest working in the global south. That's why it's please come and spend some time.
Absolutely.
Thank you again.